they have to change how they think and how they even approach the design.
From EE Tech and All About Circuits, this is Moore's Lobby. I'm your host, Daniel Bogdanoff. Today in the lobby, I'm joined by Ananth Avva, the Senior Vice President and General Manager of Cloud Platform at Altium. Altium is probably best known today for Altium Designer, the PCB design and layout tool that started in 1985 as a DOS-based program, but their cloud platform, Altium 365, helps streamline collaboration. And from my perspective, collaboration is becoming more and more important for PCB designers, so I'm very excited to pick Ananth's brain about how we as engineers and technologists can be more effective on that front. Ananth, thanks for being here today. I'm really excited for this.
Yeah, likewise. I've been looking forward to it.
Can you tell me about your role at Altium and maybe the journey that led you here?
Yeah, so I'll start with the latter, and then maybe the former part of the question will make more sense, which is historically, my entire experience has been around workflow, collaborations, and building teams. So whether you look at Rike, Pipefy, et cetera, it's always how do you make knowledge workers and not have them sort of grinding it out in mundane tasks? And I've been sort of a SaaS native person, meaning everything is sort of very contemporary, everything is consumed through a browser. And so when Altium reached out, they said, look, we're looking for someone to help bring some of those SaaS practices into the world of engineering. And one of the key things that our CEO said is like, you need to bring SaaS into engineering, not engineering into SaaS, meaning a lot of companies have tried the latter, which is bringing engineers to SaaS, and that usually goes sideways pretty fast. And I never really appreciated the gravity of that statement when it was first said. But my goal is to basically bring SaaS into engineering in an intelligent way. So all of the Altium 365 applications and tools, it's about doing it in a way where we're not disrupting sort of how you do your work. We're not going to remove things from your endpoint, put into the browser. Maybe that'll happen in the future with AI and some of the emerging technologies. But really, how do you start building this concept of collaboration and bringing in workflows and processes to elevate the gravity that electronics is having on the impact of the product? Because ultimately, if you go and look at like a Breville coffee machine or something else, the front end, like how a consumer actually consumes a product, is actually electronics, right? At the end of the day, what happens with the grinder, what happens in the end, and how the coffee comes out, that's all almost become a commodity. And so as the sort of the importance of electronics goes up, sort of bringing that context and information, so designs are made with that in mind. That's why I was brought in, and that's where I'm running all of the cloud products here at Altium.
Can you tell me maybe some horror stories or times it's gone wrong where you've seen engineering try to do SaaS versus bringing SaaS techniques into engineering?
Yeah, I mean, the classic one is where if you have like an on-prem or an endpoint tool like Altium Designer that has been built over 25 years, right? There's a lot of features, a lot of functionality where this isn't just, okay, let's just now run this on the browser and everything will be the same. And when you're coming in from a software perspective, most SaaS companies will take a Pareto optimal decision, which is, okay, what works 80% of the time, let's optimize that. The other 20%, we'll kind of put that to the side. In the world of engineering and precision, especially with electronics and other things, the 1% could actually kill the other 99% very quickly. So this notion of growth hacking that's very common in this rapid deployment that you would see in SaaS, that could be very jarring for an engineering audience versus like if you're using Gmail or Box.net or some of the other platforms. And again, that's not to sort of disparage those platforms. They have their own series of complexities, but it feels like the error rate and how you approach the problem and how much forgiveness there is at an end user level. That threshold is far, far, far lower with bringing SaaS, hence bringing SaaS to engineering versus if you just bring engineers into a SaaS ecosystem.
Yeah, the idea of waking up one day, opening up my layout tool or whatever I'm using and having it be completely different. I think about, in the early 2010s or late aughts, like the Facebook user interface changing and people would take a week or two for them to get used to that. Engineers using Altium can't necessarily afford that sort of learning curve over and over and over.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting conversations, I won't name the company, but it's a large medical device manufacturer. And I never truly appreciated this, but once I got into sitting down and having those conversations, he said, look, there's a team, there's a whole suite of people. We have our electrical engineers who understand theory, and irrespective of the tool, they'll find their way around. But there's a lot of also 2-year technical degree folks who have sort of mastered theory through practice, right? And the tooling and where the button is and how the experience comes together is absolutely important. If you just randomly go change things, it will delay a release cycle for a product by 6 months, and that would just be a massive billion-dollar impact for this business. So I totally resonate to that point.
What was it like coming out of a SaaS environment into Altium? What were some things that they do really well that surprised you, and where do you think you have some opportunities for growth?
This notion of easy to, where there's this appeal, almost like bottoms up appeal, where users generally like the product, then they genuinely have fallen in love with it. Those tenets came through very strongly. Like, meaning when you think about SaaS and a subscription model, that is the only thing you're banking on. You're banking on user trust at the end of the day and user fidelity because you're a subscription business, right? And I think Altium's done a really, really good job there. I would say where I was a bit surprised by is there's users and there's the organization. So once you go outside the user and you start building the orchestration layer across the organization itself, I think that's where there's definitely a lot of learnings for us as an organization. And I don't think it's an Altium thing per se. It's much more of like everyone's talked about how quickly things are changing in electronics, but organizations are also changing. So when we speak to there's a large automotive manufacturer that's also sort of spun up its EV division, and the EV division is almost run like incubation, like a startup, right? As opposed to the core group. They have to change how they think and how they even approach the design. And so I don't think there's like a roadmap on how you would do the change management. I think everyone's figuring this out, because just because something works for like a Tesla or Rivian doesn't mean it's going to work for you. So I think those are some of the things where we definitely could get better at, but we have to do it in such a way, again, with this whole notion of bringing engineers to SaaS and then SaaS to engineering. It's also making sure that change management is not jarring when you introduce these new concepts to engineers.
Could you give us kind of the overview of what Altium does, how the cloud platform plays into that, and then kind of where are the boundaries, like what feeds into Altium and what's the output of the Altium software?
Yeah, I would say much like Microsoft in their product suite, we've always taken the better together approach, meaning if a user doesn't understand the boundary condition between what happened in AD, Altium Designer, versus Altium 365, that's a big win for us. Again, the experience has to be seamless, right? And what you're doing in a browser versus what you're doing in an endpoint, et cetera, as a user, you should not care about that. Now, of course, from a commercial perspective or from a security perspective or from some other perspectives, there are nuances, and that's where there are conversations that we would have. But effectively, if I had to say, what is the product principle? AD is much more for an individual user who is doing and taking design. versus Altium 365 is really orchestrating all of the processes around the design and enabling what we call the shift left, which is taking decisions that may have been done more downstream, which is working with your procurement team and operations team, compliance, manufacturing, whatever those concepts are, and bringing those requirements up front, or taking the engineer from the design side and moving them further downstream, the shift right, and appreciating what's happening downstream to ensure that the design decisions don't violate what is happening downstream. So that's the boundary condition where it's more of AD is very much focused on that PCB designer, and Altium 365 is building the right context window for non-electronics participants to be able to participate and help influence design in a positive way.
So you're almost not necessarily blurring the boundaries, but trying to increase collaboration across the whole organization instead of it just being a, here's our, reference schematic, here's the parts we're using, lay it out, make it work. The conversation has to be bigger than that. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, if effectively introducing sort of the system level thinking, or giving the tooling to enable system level thinking, almost like, I know AI is like the fad, and that's where the world is headed. But if you want to have any type of a co-pilot experience where you have the right context window of information for you to make a decision, that's really what Altium 365 is doing for the PCB designer, but also for the non-PCB designer. Because a lot of times, someone who's sitting downstream, like a procurement person, had they known that a decision was being done in design, they could either prepare themselves with their RFPs or negotiations, and or vice versa, helped influence the design process to say, look, we're not compliant, or this stuff is not available in Turkey, so can you please use a part alternate? How would you do that in an intelligent way unless you have this collaboration or this digital bridge between those users? So yeah, that's absolutely right. That's what we're striving to do.
I want to dig into that in a moment, but it's time for a quick break. This episode is sponsored by Power Innovations International. Those installing new EV charging stations are hitting some familiar walls, including long product release cycles and expensive redesigns. Power Innovations International's new line of EV charging stations, including 30 and 60 kilowatt DC quick chargers, a 60 kilowatt mobile charger, and a scalable 120 to 180 kilowatt DC fast charger, tackle all these problems, featuring field configurable power input settings with no derating. No 480 volts? No problem. Learn more about the next household name in EV charging at powerinnovations.com. And now back to our conversation with Ananth Avva, the Senior Vice President and General Manager of Cloud Platform at Altium. So can you describe to me how you think a traditional PCB design and layout engineer thinks on an individual level, and how should they change and start thinking on a system level?
Yeah, I think the traditional process is much more of a waterfall process where here's the requirements, here's what you need to build, here's maybe you have a pre-approved library or some guidelines, and then you start, right? You start putting it together, and maybe there's some constraints and some DFM rules, but really you're optimizing for speed and product launch, right? Not the first prototype. Is effectively what I've seen these engineers do. They're not worried about, well, is this going to be profitable? Are these parts available? Is it compliant? What about like making sure that I have the right design and the right version, so the embedded software engineer can then know which version they're going to write into, or any of those aspects. It's like, look, not my problem. I'm going to go focus on what I have to do because I have this limited window and this time, and I'm going to ship it. And so that is, I'll say, a very traditional waterfall approach. What we're trying to bring in is, okay, I have to go build this. what are the requirements and what's the context behind the requirements. So is this particular sensory system being used in a military grade drone, or is it going to be used in a conventional drone? So now I have to worry about any of the parameters on temperature and other things. So if I can bring that context, even if I did not specify a constraint on temperature, the fact that you know the context actually helps you make some decisions, some frontline decisions downstream in the actual design process. Or if I do know that this is going to be a military grade drone versus a conventional drone, or I'm doing both, then I can actually make two different versions and two different designs. So for procurement or someone else downstream, there's maybe a wider window or a wider margin of error for anything that's high end, versus the margin pressure is much more higher on something that's lower end. So in the design process itself, I contemplated, so by the time it goes to manufacturing, we have the ability to solicit and get bids from a wider suite of manufacturers versus a narrow suite. Now, no one proactively asks these questions, but I'm a big believer that if you give human beings the right type of information and you contextualize it, they will make the right decision ultimately for the organization. So that's really the difference between a very conventional design process to this notion of us introducing system level thinking and introducing the right information, the right context to empower the user.
It sounds like a lot of almost different like buckets of data or types of data that need to be passed from team to team. How do you go about managing that? And how do you make sure that your people have the right data and the right information and the right context? You know, I'm picturing my Outlook calendar getting booked up with meetings that could have been an email, right? Like, how do you balance that and make those decisions?
It's not, unfortunately, it's not one silver bullet.
Yeah.
There's a lot of trial and error and learnings that we have to do as well. But I think there's two things. One is there's general collaboration, right? So like you said, you could Slack someone, you could email someone, you could do a meeting, etc. They're all collaborations. But then without the context of why this is happening, etc., it could be a very long meeting, or you could do like a pre-read and you can actually just get it done through Slack. So as an example, one of the principles that we do apply is any data enrichment or information that's being passed through should be in the context of where the design work's being done. So if you're thinking about a bomb,
a bill of materials bomb,
materials bomb, you may not be thinking about compliance or end of life or ROHA score or something else right off the bat. But once it's a little more stable, bringing that information into your bomb context versus you taking it, downloading it into Excel spreadsheet, uploading it somewhere else, where as you're making those design decisions and you're updating your bomb, there's a live feed coming in. So you wouldn't have taken 5 steps forward only to discover you have to take 6 steps back, because that one MC or the one thing you shouldn't have used, and now all of the dependent things need to be pulled out. That is one of the principles that we apply, which is if you can bring that information in the right context window, then the user will find that useful. Mm-hmm. Because it's not that we've done anything magical, meaning that particular information was always available. It's just that the effort level or the burden for the user to go and do this one at a time versus having that real-time feed in that context, that's where you could save a lot of time. The other one is obviously, and I was talking to a customer the other day where, we went through this whole principles of collaboration, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, look, the biggest challenge that I have is like changing behaviors, right? So at the end of the day, people will still store their library to their endpoint, but there's no notion of like a shared library. Well, now if that person leaves and a new person comes in, they have to restart and rediscover the world again of what's approved, what's not approved, etc. But even if you can build a process where the second principle would be, can you standardize some of these things that the entire team uses, like a library? So that way you would even avoid the need to go and look at the ROHA score or whatever you need to do. that would be like sort of the next level, right? So that's where either having preventative controls and bringing in a process to then reduce the sort of decision burden or fatigue factor for the user. We either build applications to do that, or we build applications where, okay, if you're having a hard time driving that change management, that's fine. We will actually deliver the information in context of where that action is being taken.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I sometimes wish there were silver bullets for these sorts of things. You know?
Yeah, and I think it's all situational, right? Like anything that you do, and a lot of things that we've done on the Altium 365 side, even though it's a cloud platform, you do not have to change everything at once. Meaning, one of the key principles in any type of SaaS application is you want to make sure that you meet the user where they are. So if you're using Slack, you don't have to use all the automation functions day one, but you will use the @mention, which is effectively like a pseudo easier way to trigger someone, as opposed to going in and finding them, clicking on their name and doing it. So this modularization of the experience, so you can start with something basic and you can get the gist of it and evolve with the product. That's actually a huge component in helping engineering managers drive change in their teams.
Interesting. I never thought about change management and like UX design going hand in hand in onboarding experiences.
Yeah,
being a change management thing, but
I will say the consistent thing that I hear with almost any customer is there's a shortage of talent still. It's not that that's gone away. And the onboarding time and the avoidance of all of these sort of misunderstandings or gaps, or when I was talking to one government entity where they cannot use certain distributors, and that decision was made overnight because of some ruling that came from the top because of some security reason, right? And how do you pass that knowledge through, right? Like, how does this compliance person go and convince 500 people who may have been sourcing a certain part from that one distributor or that one entity in a seamless way? So unless you have like a UI UX where a user doesn't mind interacting in that environment and they see value in it, actually enforcing those changes become much harder.
Well, as we talk about, kind of adapting and learning tools and systems, can you talk about, for those who are unfamiliar, the difference between, you touched on Altium Designer and Altium 365. Where are the lines drawn there, and why would one use one or the other?
I think of Altium Designer as a system of record. Ultimately, that is where your design lives. That is where the actual, sort of in the RFLP process, that's where the layout and physical aspects of your design are happening. The Altium 365 is more of a system of engagement to then drive those actions into the design. So in Altium 365, we manifest different front ends. So there'll be like an application, which is effectively a front end for a procurement persona, where they're not going to be exposed to the intricacies and the schematic and other things because that's irrelevant for them. But they will have a live feed into UI UX that they're used to, which is a spreadsheet, and which is a bum. But it's a live feed, so they don't have to worry about is it out of cycle or not. You can have a front end for a software engineer who is a general collaborator, where the biggest common complaint we hear from customers, especially a lot of customers have mixed CAD environments. So
yeah,
they will have pads, Altium Designer, et cetera. But that's fine for that team. But if you're like a federated instance, like a procurement or like a software team, you're just like, I just want to know which version I'm supposed to look at. And where's my Git, or where's my Google Drive or OneDrive to go and see which version I'm supposed to work on? That would be sort of like another very common application that we would introduce on 365 to bring those users in. Integrations, so like a Jira integration, some of your cloud-to-cloud PLM integrations where you're not looking for deep customization, et cetera, but you're looking for something out of the box. those are applications that we would offer in 365. So basically, the second you step out of the world of the actual design process and you're starting to now collaborate or interact with someone outside the design process, like a mechanical engineer, a simulation engineer, ops, procurement, software engineer, those applications get surfaced in Altium 365.
It almost feels a little bit like a mini OSI stack where you kind of have the designers in the designer tool doing their thing. And then it's like, oh, how do we communicate this out? I think about a board I was working on with the designer, and I was able to go into Altium 365 just in my browser and look at a full 3D model of the board and check the layer spacings and all that and confirm. And that was incredibly useful.
Yeah. I think we're social animals. A lot of times you may not even realize like that information is actually quite pertinent. I mean, we have attorneys who come in and look at the design for patents and other areas too. So we've just been surprised that what kind of animals come into the zoo. Like you wouldn't even anticipate that this would happen. And they have their own requirements. They use tasks as a way to manage their some compliance process, right, on their back end. So it's been really enlightening to see the wealth of players around electronics development.
As much as I want to dig into lawyers being animals in a zoo, I won't go there. Instead, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back. This episode is sponsored by Power Innovations International. PII's charging stations are built for reliability and convenience. They leverage a PSU topology with a demonstrated mean time between failure of over 1 million hours. Maybe your experience with EV charging has been one marked with frustration, long lead times, expensive step-up transformers, or just a list of broken stations that can't charge up your car. With PII's family of level 3 charging stations, that's all about to change. No 480 volts? No problem. Learn more about the next household name in EV charging at powerinnovations.com. Ananth, you just mentioned patent lawyers being a common use case for Altium 365. Are there any other surprising situations or folks that you see using this system?
Interestingly, one of a big other set of big proponents are IT compliance and CIO personnel. So conversation goes something like this. It's like, okay, you should probably leverage some sort of a cloud instance to back up all your data, your information, collaboration, et cetera. It's probably a good thing. I said, well, we don't trust the cloud. And you say, okay, it's fine. So what do you do today? Like, how do you send something over to a manufacturer? And how do you know that that's not being forwarded to someone else and effectively your IP is going out the window? There's a classic response. Well, we just zip everything out and the Gerber file and all of the detail, and then we email it.
Right.
And then there's like the Mr. Obvious statement. Well, that's certainly backed into the cloud if you're using Microsoft 365 or Gmail. But secondarily, now you have no control on who's accessing that information, where it's going. And so one of the things that surprised me is the awareness level at an organizational side. Like if I went and spoke to the CEO of some company and say, all of your IP, you're an electronics product company, but all of your IP is just being emailed around, and you're not quite sure where the things are headed, they would just be like floored. Well, what do you mean, right?
Yeah.
But that's the reality. Like in a lot of our customers, even today, where this notion of artificial control because it's in my sort of computer and not leveraging sort of all the transitions that we've done for everything else in our life, like email, et cetera, where we move to the cloud, where it is actually much more secure. IT folks have actually been a really interesting sort of advocate for this digital transformation. Now, of course, there's secondary benefits, like meaning the primary benefit, if you can think of that as security, secondary benefit is collaboration. I would never say like the primary reason why you should go to cloud is security. I would always say collaboration trumps everything else because that's speed to market, lower costs, all that stuff. But this education at an organizational level and the why has been like another interesting sort of motion that we've seen, where our GovCloud instance of Altium 365 is one of the most sort of engaging applications, largely because if you're a small subcontractor for the US government and you have to drive to the compliance standards, the risk that your poor IT manager is going to take to back on a server sitting in a closet is far higher than if you were to back it on Amazon Cloud and have all of the Amazon GovCloud specifically and have all of the redundancies and access controls and log data and information that you couldn't even dream of orchestrating or imagining putting it on the server in the cloud.
Yeah, when I hear ITAR, I run the other direction. It's like, that's ITAR? That's not me. Sorry.
Exactly.
So can you do that on with the cloud platform? You can.
That's a big reason that a lot of customers go, is definitely for government, is to effectively go to GovCloud and manage their risk that way.
So you've mentioned a couple times that the world of electronics is changing, and one thing I've seen is the ability to just 3D print an enclosure for your PCB, but that brings in a lot of other challenges on the design side and flex PCBs, that sort of thing. How is that shift impacting your workflows, and how do you play with other disciplines that are maybe not pure electrical engineering and like board layout folks?
Yeah, it's definitely where this sort of boundary condition of mechanical and MCAD versus ECAD is being blurred in a very real way, especially with harness design and flexiboards that you mentioned, where collaboration's now taken to a whole new level where you almost need this real-time feedback loop, and any of the system engineering constraints that are coming on top of the mechanical side also need to be considered in electronics and vice versa. So that's where that we have one application in Altium 365, and the only way to do this is on a browser because you have two different CAD tools and you have to bring and sync that metadata, is leveraging our MCAD co-designer so you can work across all the different MCAD tools. But that is going to continue, in my mind, propagate itself as electronics continue to get more and more complex. Like I just see a massive sort of shift in sort of engineering practices to bring those two teams together in a more real way.
Gosh, the longer I'm in the world of engineering, the more I appreciate the folks that can understand the systems they're a part of. And they can see what the folks around them are working on and understand how their own piece of the puzzle fits into the bigger picture. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about AI. And what do you think is its role in circuit design, and how will it impact Altium down the road?
In my belief, especially when we started off with this notion of bringing SaaS to engineering or engineers to SaaS, AI is again one of those things where hallucinations and other things are real. And any AI tool that's deployed without being battle hardened, it will not stand the test of time. So now, how do you solve that, right? Because now you have like a chicken and egg problem, which is, well, in order for me to get a better AI model, I need to train on it, and I need to go through these cycles, and then it can harden it, etc. That's one way to do it, and that's where you see like ChatGPT 4.0 now and others, where with LLM models where you just have tons of data out there, you can basically brute force your way and get up the stack. And again, I'm oversimplifying that, but that's sort of the gist of it. But the other way to do it is also ensuring that, and again, this is where the notion of what is AI, what's ML gets blurred. But if you can basically have a very clear system of record and a clear system of engagement, and the data gets contextualized, whether it's a human doing the contextualization or an AI agent doing the contextualization, that's where this probability of a hallucination or things going bad real fast gets reduced. So my suspicion is, again, using the Microsoft principles, like whatever comes out first will be like a co-pilot experience in circuit design, and it'll go forward. And it'll probably start at the peripheral. So our hypothesis right now is, as opposed to the core design per se, a lot of the things that happen on the supply chain side, where you're about to select a part and then it violates some parameter. Now, can you get an alternative part without having to go through a Octopart?
Yeah.
That would be an obvious sort of application where you could still sort of leverage the parametric information at component level like we have right now and have the part alternative suggestion. But the user's still in control, and it's a co-pilot where it's not going to hallucinate and just put something in there and you're like, wait, what just happened, right? So that's where it may sound very basic, and that'll be like the productivity hack, like essentially where you start improving it. But then now if you have your procurement folks and you have other folks downstream who are also participating in it, where there's other constraints that are not parameterized today. So we have voltage, we have temperature, all that stuff. That's great. But then there's some profit margin or there's some supply chain constraint in certain regions where it's not available. Well, that data is not available, right, publicly, but it is going to be available in your instance. And now an AI agent can say, well, that's a new parameter that we have to consider, because it seems like these users constantly make the decision based on inventory levels or profitability levels or some other analytical tool that's being used downstream. So now all of a sudden you actually have a co-pilot, not just at the user level in terms of just the design, but you're bringing in a co-pilot at an organizational level and bringing the procurement sort of assistant to yourself who's helping you with the right decision for a part. And so that's where I definitely will say, like, the proliferation of AI applications in circuit design, I definitely see that as sort of like, it can happen very quickly. The only precondition being, of course, is if we want to go beyond simple part alternates or simple use cases and starting to go into more complex use cases, you need fidelity in some type of system of engagement. And that's largely why, at least from an Altium perspective, we start to pursue this notion of cloud. It's not necessarily just because cloud is easier or better or anything or more secure, but it's also giving you that metadata to enable any type of AI agents in the future.
That makes a ton of sense. Yeah, I've talked with a lot of full-time board designers about AI design, and we've had some AI board and circuit companies on this podcast. And one of the things that I keep hearing from people is like, well, just because you can draw a picture that looks like a circuit board doesn't mean that layout is going to actually match the requirements.
Oh, yeah.
Amperage and crosstalk and all those nuancy type things that designers are so good at.
My father-in-law, he does some of these board designs, and like somehow, and these are more like for PCs, and he'd tell me these stories where something would be catching on fire or there'd be some issue. And I won't name the company, but it's an international company. So he had to be the RMA engineer in the US who would have to do the troubleshooting to see what just happened. And he would just instinctively know it's that resistor or it's something here or there's some manufacturing defect. This tribal knowledge that's been accumulated, and he had been doing it for 40 plus years. So the tribal knowledge that was accumulated, it's very difficult to emulate overnight. But the hope, at least, is if you have the system of engagement, you're sort of you have pieces of the puzzle, you're reducing the load on the actual designer and reducing decision fatigue when they're making some of those changes.
And even I imagine, and I'm just kind of spitballing here, but there's a world where you could say, hey, we saw you did this thing, like we flagged that as a potential area where it could be a problem.
Yeah.
Like, why don't you check that out? It seems like a good co-pilot type approach.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's more mitigating. I think the first sort of co-pilot applications tend to be collaboration and productivity oriented. The second one tend to be more mitigating the downside risk, where I think you made a bad decision. Do you want to override and ignore me, like your Grammarly, when something go lit up in red? Then the third iteration is, oh, actually, I'm going to go and now like Grammarly give you a better sentence with the tone that I think you're trying to evoke, right?
Right.
Yeah, the first two are definitely a precondition before you can jump to number three, because you need some sort of feedback loop.
Absolutely. So we've talked a little bit kind of on a more engineering technical level. I'd love to touch on company processes and culture and change management a bit. You came into Altium that has a ton of tribal knowledge and a ton of rich history in this space, and are trying to get folks to, as I understand it, think a little bit differently about how to go about building these enterprise grade pieces of software and tools. What are some common mistakes you've seen other companies make as they try to do this change management? And what are some things that you found to be especially useful as you're talking with your teams?
There's many, but I would say one of the biggest things that I've encountered is the cost of change is so high that I'm just going to avoid it. I'm just not even going to have this conversation right now. And it's really interesting. Like I went on this a little tour of duty and sitting down face to face with customers, where I had my customer success team say, I want to just talk to those customers who tried 365, but they just never activated. Like someone came in and they just chose not to come in. And one conversation was super interesting. It was this company in Chicago, and I sat down and I said, look, I'm not here to sell you anything. I'm just trying to understand like what happened. And he said, yeah, I tried it. First, it was the classic, well, my management team doesn't trust cloud, so I can go to cloud. And and this company, they make alternators for trains and buses and things where their design data that's going back 2-3 decades, right? So that's a lot of information that is literally sitting on a server in the middle of the floor. And then they use PaaS, they use KeyCAD, they use AD, etc. And so they just don't trust cloud. And I said, well, where is this being manufactured, etc. And we go through this classic sort of song and dance about, well, actually, your information is probably out there and it's probably worse in terms of what you're doing right now. Worse if you do 365. And he agreed. And he said, yeah, actually, you're right. It's probably safer for us to go to the cloud. And then it was, well, so now, like, let's say that's out of the way. What's the gap? And he says, well, I'm not sure, like, if my engineers are willing to go to this centralized system, like where we centralize our libraries. We have a process where you're effectively using Altium 365 almost like a Git. I'm not sure if they'll say, okay, well, why don't we go and talk to them? Like, let's just bring them together and we'll walk them through 365, etc. And it wasn't like a slam dunk. Like, I think half the people said, well, this just seems like more work without any benefit for me. Like, meaning, you could see how it's benefiting the organization if this information is cleanly organized, etc. But what's in it for me? And that's fair. But I think quickly after that, when we started to say, well, all of these legacy designs, we can automatically tell you where these components or parts no longer exist, or you have to do a redesign because if there's something breaks, you're still on the hook to go and build new designs. And they're like, oh, okay. Like, now I could see now where it's not some random act of violence where there's crazy fire drill where someone says this needs to change because something broke, and oh my gosh, like these components are no longer available. Like the drama goes away. They're like, oh, okay, I could see that, and then all of a sudden, like literally, it wasn't that long. It was maybe like 30 to 45 minutes. You got more head nods to say, yeah, this makes sense. Like we should attempt to do it.
Yeah,
and then after that, it's like, okay, so like, why don't we start? Like, I'm not going to charge you for it. It's like, can we move, right, this stack to the cloud and the apps? And it was disheartening, but it was also interesting at the end. He said, look, I'm about 2 years away from retirement. I just want to go and not worry about like all of this. Like, it's just been stressful enough. And they had just come out of like some really difficult times through COVID and a bunch of other things. I said, okay, I respect that. And I said, well, can we at least put this as an option for your successor and at least make sure that they're aware, right, that this exists? And he said, fine. So there wasn't like a good ending to it in the traditional sense, but every time I have like these conversations, I think this perception that people are not willing to change, like my team's not willing to change, or this is going to be really hard, or we're going to have to relearn everything, etc. A lot of users and a lot of organizations overestimate that, and they more often than not undersize the benefits or the consequences, meaning, okay, what's the alternative? Let's say you don't do it. The world is headed that way anyway. So what happens? Like, let's fast forward this 5 years. You're going to have to do it then. It's going to be worse because that's more data, more change management to go through. So that's the one thing that I've consistently run into is the cost of change is always overestimated. The benefit is underestimated, and the whys behind why not to change, they're a bit of a phantom menace. It like when you start sort of doing the decomposition, it's not actually quite that bad.
Yeah, and the cost of not changing might feel low, but not changing is also a conscious choice.
Yes,
and we'll eventually catch up.
Yes.
It's time for one more quick break. We'll be right back. This episode is sponsored by Power Innovations International. It's a common story. An exciting EV charging installation plan is ground to a halt while months, if not years, go by because of required infrastructure investments. It doesn't have to be this way. PII's Level 3 EV charging stations work with 240-volt single-phase, 208 or 240-volt three-phase Delta, and 480-volt three-phase Y, all in one product with no derating. These field configurable chargers are changing what's possible with EV charging around the world. No 480 volts? No problem. Learn about the next household name in EV charging at powerinnovations.com. And now back to our conversation with Anna. I'd love to touch on Renesas acquiring Altium. In your mind, what's that world going to be like, and how is that going to benefit the Altium users?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, the transaction hasn't sort of matriculated or it hasn't been completed. So for better or for worse, I can't say much about specifics.
Understood.
But I think largely the big positive here is Altium will continue to be the sort of an electronics industry oriented product where we will build the electronic system design and lifecycle management platform. And there's, of course, a lot of details in there to unpack, but the gist of it is this notion of system level thinking and continuing to bring more elements of system level thinking into the electronics design process.
Yeah, it's an interesting landscape to see a traditionally semiconductor company and a traditionally layout and design company come together as kind of one powerhouse.
Yeah, no, it's going to be incredible for the industry as a whole over the next few years.
We like to do some lightning round questions at the very end. You said KiCad and not KiCad, so I have to assume you're team KiCad on the pronunciation side.
Yeah, we're on KiCad.
Okay. So Altium says KiCad. That's a interesting little tidbit. I saw you're the co-founder of a company called Marshall Me for like computer vision martial arts detection. Can you give me the 30-second elevator pitch of that?
Yeah, so I used to practice martial arts. Unfortunately, just relocated recently, so I'm looking for a new school. But when COVID hit, one of the biggest challenges is to learn. It was almost impossible because martial arts is one of those things that's just very tangible. So if you have to jump and do like a 360 spin kick, especially for someone who's like a geriatric martial artist, because I took it up when I was 35 years old, it was way past the prime. is very hard to train on it. And one of the interesting things was, can you leverage computer vision to basically see if your movement is correct and your balance is correct? And whether you're a 40-year-old or whether you're like a 5-year-old, where human evolution is we have to see it, and we're very quick at sort of imprinting if we can see it.
Yeah.
So the thesis is, can we use computer vision to basically help with pose detection to help with martial artists?
Very cool. What type of martial arts do you practice?
Hwarangdo,
Okay.
like a Korean martial art.
Very cool. As a 35-year-old, I feel like I might be in my prime still a little bit. So I'm going to hold on to that for the next 5 or 10 years at least. Last question for you. If you could wave a magic wand and magically have either like a new capability inside of Altium, or have designers kind of flip a switch in their brains and all get on board with a certain thing, what would you do with that magic wand?
If we can get electronic engineers to somehow absorb and contextualize information at the organization of how what they're building would sort of manifests itself into broader products. And if we can do that easily, intelligently, without being burdensome, I would love to find that magic wand or that switch.
If I find it, I'll let you know.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. This is great.
Yeah, likewise. It's been great.
That was Ananth Avva, the Senior Vice President and General Manager of Cloud Platform at Altium. Most of my interactions with Altium folks so far have been around like PCB design and layout tips. So this was really interesting for me to get a unique perspective at what's keeping this industry ticking. I hope you enjoyed it as well. If you did, help us out with a little collaboration and share this episode with a friend or coworker, and come say hi on the Moore's Lobby social media pages. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for joining me today in the lobby, and I hope your auto router is in a good mood this week. And if not, I'll have my new buddy Ananth put in a good word for you. I'm your host, Daniel Bogdanoff, and I'll catch you next time.